Well, I don't know if you realised it, but that was the end of Mark's Gospel. After all that lengthy telling of the crucifixion, and then suddenly in just a few sentences, it's all over. In glorious good news, but also with some ambiguity. They went out in terror and amazement and said nothing to anybody, for they were afraid. The Gospel of Mark ends abruptly and without any appearance of the resurrected Lord. 3 women go to the tomb to anoint his body. They're startled to find the stone rolled away. They enter the tomb and are alarmed, and they're alarmed to see a young man in a white robe. Do not be alarmed, he says. That's what you'd expect him to say, isn't it? Do not be alarmed. Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, has been raised. Go tell his disciples and Peter that he'll meet you all in Galilee. The women flee from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's the end of Mark's story. Indeed, the real situation is slightly worse, because in the original language, that final sentence ends with a conjunction that should not conclude any sentence anywhere, not really anyway. And the church has been puzzled, perhaps even embarrassed, by this ending of the Gospel of Mark. It's been puzzled about this since ancient times. That's why there are multiple endings in your Bible after verse 8. One of the difficulties when I send you things out is you just read it straight from the page. But if you read it from a Bible, you'd notice that after I stopped at verse 8, there are probably multiple endings in your Bible. Well, none of these were part of the original work. All of them were added later, out of the puzzlement and perhaps embarrassment of the church at a, well, incomplete gospel that ends in fear and with a conjunction that shouldn't end a sentence, never mind a book of the Bible. Now, there's no doubt about Mark's belief in the resurrection. The gospel has been anticipating it since about the middle of the book. You might remember that from the end of the 8th chapter, Jesus begins to foretell of his impending death. 3 times, Jesus predicts that he will be rejected, that he will suffer and die. What is less remembered, strangely, is that Jesus ends all 3 passion predictions with the crucial words, "And after 3 days, will rise again." Yes, with every foretelling of his death, there's a foretelling of his resurrection. In fact, throughout the Gospel of Mark, there are all kinds of intimations of resurrection. After the transfiguration, for example, Jesus tells his disciples to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. There's no doubt Mark's gospel is thoroughly an Easter gospel. It believes entirely and thoroughly in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. What's more, the gospel concludes with a resurrection proclamation, the one we just read, and also a promise. Do not be alarmed. The young man in white, whom we think of as an angel usually, do not be alarmed, he says. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who has been crucified. He has been raised. He's not here, but he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Yet the Gospel of Mark provides no story in which Jesus actually reappears to those disciples. And this is perhaps even more puzzling, after the very lengthy description that Mark provides for the passion and crucifixion of Jesus. We read it on Good Friday so movingly. Those, Mark has 16 chapters, but nobody tells you that, 14 and 15 are rather long chapters. Is it chapter 14 that has about 70 verses or so? They go on and on with all kinds of detail. Yes, the gospel takes its time, lingering over certain incidental details of the passion narrative. Indeed, this gospel has been characterized as a lengthy passion narrative with a short introduction, and we might add, with an even shorter conclusion. So what are we to make of this sudden ending of the Gospel of Mark? Many answers have been posited through the years. Perhaps Mark fell ill before finishing his work. Perhaps he even had a sudden heart attack in mid-sentence, and that's why he ends with a conjunction that shouldn't be used for the ending of a sentence, especially the ending of a book. Or perhaps there was a longer narrative, but the original manuscript became brittle and the final words simply broke off the end of it, shortening an originally longer gospel. Or perhaps Mark meant it. Yes, perhaps Mark intended to leave his gospel unfinished and incomplete. After all, the beginning of the Gospel of Mark is a little bit weird too. Some find it quite weird, some think it's not so weird at all, but I'll leave you to read it for yourself and see what you think. But the opening sentence reads, "The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Now, you do know that the titles of all the Gospels in our Bible were added sometime after their composition. You know those gospel titles, the Gospel according to St. Mark or St. John or St. Matthew, St. Luke, and so on and so forth. They were all added later. Some scholars think that the first sentence of Mark's Gospel was its original title, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. An original title of the Gospel, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Thus, the story that Mark tells of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus would be just the beginning of the good news, the beginning of the Gospel. By this interpretation, the Gospel story has no ending. It cannot really have an ending, because it's still being written by the disciples of Jesus, who keep on meeting him after his resurrection, generation after generation. Certainly we know that the women did not stay silent. They who said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid, must have found their tongues. Otherwise, the story would have died with them, and we would not be reading of their visit to the tomb, their encounter with the young man, and his resurrection announcement, instruction, and promise. I think we can be thankful that details are given in the other three Gospels and in other parts of the New Testament, like 1 Corinthians 15. However, the Gospel of Mark, whether by accident or design, tells a different but equally important kind of tale. First, its emphasis on the passion, the crucifixion story, is important. Sometimes Christians tell the resurrection story as if it so completely trumps the crucifixion. They relegate the suffering and death of Jesus to a kind of necessary prelude to resurrection triumph. Mark, I would suggest, resists that idea altogether, and I think we should too. Mark tarries with pain, suffering, distress, abandonment, darkness, and death. Perhaps because these aspects characterize the hours of Jesus's death and continue to characterize the lives of many human beings the world over. There continued to be the experience of the early church, scourged by persecution. There continued to be the experience of people persecuted for their faith in many parts of the world today. Mark seems to shout out loud, you can't just forget the pain and suffering of a world too often identified by darkness and death. But there, in the darkness and death, comes a proclamation and a promise. He is not here. He is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Well, the other Gospels tell of multiple meetings long before they ever got back to Galilee. But the disciples will go back to Galilee, just as we must go back to our ordinary lives after the Easter celebrations. And there in Galilee, or in Manchester, and wherever we live, even in darkness and distress, Christ promises to meet his disciples. He's gone ahead of you. He's gone before you. You'll see him there, just as he promised. We who have encountered the risen Lord have a wonderful story to tell of the one who died and rose again, who brought us from death to life, and who fills our lives now by his risen presence. Jesus promised to meet his disciples in Galilee. He promises to meet today's disciples too, in Manchester or wherever they live. For Jesus, who was crucified, is now risen. He has conquered death. And we who keep on being met by him have a gospel to complete and a brand new story to tell. He is going ahead of you. There you will see him, just as he told you. Thanks be to God.